Yeah, I want to tell you about some very sort of influential general frameworks about cognition, which are particularly relevant to language, okay? And you might have heard already about the modularity of mind, or that approach called modularism. Has any one of you heard about this already? Raise your hand. Okay. Not many, so it's good that I introduced this kind of stuff. So, oh yeah. So, back in the 80s, this guy who unfortunately passed away recently, Jerry Fodor, very, very influential psychologist and philosopher, he had this idea which had a lot of connection to what was happening. If you remember, we talked about that in the so-called cognitive revolution. So when you talk about the cognitive revolution, you often refer to Noam Chomsky on the language side, David Marr on the cognition vision side, and Fodor more in the semantics philosophy of cognition side, okay? And these guys kind of agreed on the same architecture of the mind. So we're talking about the architecture of the mind, right? And which is mapped on the architecture of the brain somehow. So the idea is that modularity provided a very strong computational and implementational framework for linguistic modularity, okay? So what is the modularity of mind? What is the modularism approach? Basically, it's based on the notion of modules, right? So a module is a sort of a device which has certain properties, very important properties. The first one is that it's informationally encapsulated, okay? So think about, for instance, the module of phonology, okay? Where you compute and perceive and build up your phonemes. So we talked a lot about the difference between phonetics and phonology, right? And in phonology, you sort of categorize through phonetic sounds, and then you have these discrete categories. It's a little bit like when you read words or when you hear words, and these are sort of subparts of words, right? Which make up phonemes. Okay, so the idea is that your phonological module is blind to external modules. So it receives an input, probably from your phonetic analysis, and it transmits an output, arguably to the lexical or syntactic module, okay? So its internal computation, it's not affected by other modules, especially not affected by the modules to which it's gonna pass the information on, right? For instance, semantics. Your semantics cannot influence your phonological perception. Your syntax cannot influence your phonological perception. The only thing that can influence your phonological perception is the input that it receives from the speech processing components, okay? And all these modules, of course, are likely to be implemented in different brain areas. So we might talk about phonological module in your left posterior STG or anterior STG, in fact, or in like localized in two areas, for instance, supramarginal gyrus, Wernicke's area. Okay. Again, even if it's like two areas, the property of the module does not change. It's still blind to external information. Okay. Right. So, if you have your language faculty, then you can just dump it down in different modules. You have phonology, computing phonological information, then you have it passed on to morphosyntax, right? Which builds the structure of the sentence. Then you have it passed on semantics, which starts an interpretation, a literary interpretation, or the, formal semantics interpretation of a sentence. And then it finally gets passed to pragmatics, which links the semantic representation that you assign to the assertion to context, word knowledge, intentions, information about the speakers, inferences, and what more, okay? So the idea is that you cannot get a concrete, real let's say, mental model of the sentence that you heard until you get to the very last stage, okay? All these stages, for that fast, automatic, and serial they might be, right? They're not really giving you a final result, a final comprehension of the sentence. So I already told you other features of this. The processing is strictly serial, okay? Which means that once you pass the information from phonology to morphosyntax, you cannot go back. You can only go to one direction, this to this, to this, to this, and to this, or start over again, okay? It doesn't mean that you cannot have, for instance, a reanalysis. You can have a syntactic reanalysis, but that would happen within the syntactic module. Or you can have a, you know, a complete reinterpretation of the sentence, changing the words in the sentence, but then you have to start over again. You have no feedback, okay? Yeah, the input of module was passed as input to the next module. No jumps, no feedback, and most importantly, no parallel processing. Your semantics cannot start processing your linguistic input before the syntactic module has done its job, right? It has to wait. Okay, so this was, you know, a very, very influential framework, but it entered in a strong crisis, especially in the 90s and zeros. Why? Well, for a kind of a lot of reasons, right? And we have seen some of these reasons. So for instance, we have seen that there is no clear localization of linguistic functions. A lot of different linguistic functions seems to be processed in a lot of different areas. So if you wanna tell me that for you, the syntactic module is in BA44, right? Then I'm gonna ask you, okay, but why then, if you have a damage to posterior STG, why do you have semantic deficits, okay? And still you might say, yeah, you know, because somehow, I don't know, PSTG might do some lexical post-syntactic processing, but that it would still affect some kind of syntactic function. But then I would tell you, okay, but then you are saying that your syntax is not just dependent on the information processing in Broca's area, but also in some other areas, okay? So basically, we have seen over and over that a single area is multimodal, and a single function is processed in different areas. So we don't talk about single circuits anymore. We rather talk about networks, right? I guess this is not surprising to you. And we have seen questions very hard to answer, like where is semantics? Where is the center of concepts, right? Where semantics happen to be processed in some areas which are not just selective for semantics. The rise of the distributed networks. And also the other problem, maybe even more severe than this one, because then you can always say, I don't have one module, I don't have one module in one area, I have a module in like 10 areas. Fine, still a module. It would still work serially and blindly to extra module information. Well, this is another problem. The demise of strict seriality. There is, you know, more and more evidence that our brain and our cognition does not operate in a serial way. It's rather the opposite. It's parallel processing and highly interactive systems are the rule at the macro level in our brain, okay? So when you talk about some sort of behavioral function, which is, you know, not super sophisticated, but not super simple, like for instance, repetition of words, okay? Or phonological analysis. Even if we take something basics, way more basic than semantics, still we are gonna find that function processed by a sort of an interaction of different areas of the brain which are not even close to each other, okay? So parallel and high interactive systems. So for instance, Broca's and Wernicke's area are directly linked with sensorial, associative, and motor cortices through adjacent and long-distance cortical connections, okay? Just a few years ago, we thought that Broca's area was a premotor area, right? Whereas now we think that even the premotor area has some kind of abstract functionality. So, shifting paradigm. Right. We have, you know, the kind of exactly the same kind of network that we have been talking about and that we will talk about today again in chimps, okay? Take a chimp. You're going to find a little Broca's area, a little Wernicke's area, a little arcuate fasciculus, a little external capsule, okay? Same things, but just the chimp will never be able to speak. So it's, you know, it's a problem because there is not a sort of a binary correspondence between the structure and the function of the structure. We have individuals that have very similar structures, but they do not display the same function. And probably vice versa, we have birds who are much more sophisticated vocalizers than a lot of mammals, right? But they have a different kind of brain. So if you want, I can give you some papers about this, which kind of look at parallels of phonological processing in birds, mammals, monkeys, and humans, okay? But you got the main idea. Right, then we have the idea of conceptual grounding. In order to understand concepts, you might have to activate the very sensory motor areas that you had active when you formed those concepts, okay? Concepts of red apple would activate even the sensorial areas of your tongue when you eat red apple, and kind of in automatic fashion. And then there is a lot of debate, is this activation of sensory motor areas required for the concepts, or it's just a sort of a cascade effect? Okay, you have activation of motor areas in comprehension tasks very early. And again, you know, a lot of experiments like this one by Garagnani and Pulvermüller, where they sort of track the cortical activation for the word leak. And then you would activate the motor areas of your mouth, whereas the word peak would activate the motor areas of your hand, and the word kick would activate the motor areas of your foot. You remember the motor homunculus, right? So, you know, things are more interactive than we thought. Right, before going this, before going to this, there is another thing that I haven't probably highlighted enough, that we do have feedback, okay? So, surprise, surprise, for instance, your identification of phonological categories, your identification of words, your lexical access, your syntactic computations, your syntactic structure building is influenced from guys that are at the top of the chain. Semantics, extra linguistic knowledge, intentions, context, what most, okay? Everything might actually influence the processing or might modulate, okay? The technical term for this is modulation. Your syntactic decisions are in fact influenced by your lexical processing or by your semantic processing, okay? So there's not a clear bottom-up chain of blind steps, but it's more like a lot of feedback and feed-forward transmission of information, and all these things have been proved or supported by a lot of evidence at the neural level. So even in, for instance, in vision, a lot of studies have been done in vision. In vision, you have a lot of cortical projection from your primary visual cortex to higher level cortices and feedback projections, okay? And we have seen example of this, for instance, in phonological processing, when we found the generator of the MEG effect of phonological categories in your primary auditory cortex, although this information was probably processed in some higher level cortices like STS, STG. Okay, so there is a, you know, in neuroscience now, the strong modularity is not considered seriously anymore. Okay, but it was a good hypothesis. Then, if you remember, we talked about the visual cortex of the rodents. So if you just take a tiny fraction of the cortex, then you might actually find that all these neurons are highly interconnected to each other, and they are organized in a functional way. So at the micro level, you might talk about a little module, a micro module of that little piece of cortex, which, for instance, processing a specific kind of information like the orientation of the line, okay? So it's not that you cannot talk about the module. It's not that you cannot talk about modules at all, but the idea of modularity is more useful or more empirically supported when you go to the micro level. When you talk about complex and high-level functions that recruit a lot of areas, then the rules of modularity do not apply anymore. Okay. So, alternative ideas. Meet the mirror neurons. So the mirror neurons were an approach that became famous like 30 years ago, and it provides support for the so-called embodied view of language. Okay, what does it mean? So what are mirror neurons? Mirror neurons, for instance, were discovered by the Rizzolati's group in Parma when they were recording a single cell, okay? So they were recording the activity of a single neurons, and then they found these neurons in the monkey, which are active, for instance, when the monkey picks up a ball, but also when the monkey is looking at someone doing the same gesture, okay? Or when the monkey grabs a banana, and when the monkey sees a conspecific or a human grasping a banana. So then the idea is that this monkey were coding some abstract property of the action. Okay, so they were sensitive to, for instance, goal-directed action, and they would you know, their activities due to a sort of a simulation of the action in your own system by looking at someone else doing that action, okay? So for instance, they found interesting effects of mirror neurons in animals, in monkeys, for instance, when a human would imitate an action with their lips, but not with a dog, because you cannot sort of, you know, you like sort of simulate you being a dog, but if you're a monkey, it's easier to simulate being a human because you have much more similar morphological feature, okay? So, you know, they claim that these are also very important for empathy, for emotions. One of the reasons to autism, they kind of try to explain everything with mirror neurons, okay? But there was one important thing, that there was a strong claim that mirror neurons, as they have been found in monkeys, could be found in humans as well, okay? So you see the system, you might remember these areas, right? This is just Broca's area. This is just your premotor cortex. This is your probably angular gyrus, and this is your superior temporal gyrus. So always the same areas. And in the monkeys, you find the homologue of these areas. So your Broca's area would be in this area called F5, okay? Good. So this was big support for the embodied view of language, which is still very famous, let's say, okay? Which the strong version of this theory maintained that not only the meaning is grounded in the motor system, but linguistic meaning is processed by the brain in the very same motor representation involved in perceiving, controlling, and executing motor programs. So syntax is not processed by some sort of operation operating in abstract categories, but it's just processed with the same kind of operations that would perform sensorial or motor processing, okay? So a new cognitive primitive mechanism, internal simulation. And that is used to construct novel conceptual representation by extending your representation. So for instance, you eat a red apple, you like it, you sort of build a motor sensorial representation of this red apple, you abstract over that, and then maybe you can create a concept of apples, which would share certain low-level activation with the red apple, but would be able to abstract over that, okay? So it, you know, concepts come from experience and they sort of abstract on activation that are associated together among different objects. But then we might ask, can symbolic representation still exist? And some of the hardcore people in this framework will say, no. The abstract symbol view of meaning is one of the most remarkable misunderstandings in the history of science, said Edelman, who got a Nobel Prize for chemistry. So, you know, probably might be wrong. But also Gallese and Lakoff, you know, super famous philosopher Lakoff, super famous neuroscientist Gallese. Neither semantics nor grammar is symbolic in the sense of theory of formal systems, which consist of rules manipulating disembodied, meaningless symbols, okay? Now, if you want to read a critic to this approach, read my review, which you can find in the paper pool, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Let me just say that, yeah, there are problems to this view, right? And one of the problems is that even if you maintain that abstraction is derived from low-level sensorial or motor information by kind of associations, right? If you don't explain how these associations work, you are just kind of rephrasing certain things that we call abstract, symbolic, disembodied processes, right? So there are some also philosophical problems, and we are not going to go through that now, right? Yeah, but the only thing that I'm going to tell you is that mirror neurons, at least in their hardcore, strong hypotheses, are not really considered anymore in modern neuroscience. Actually, there has been a lot of a strong disaffection in the mirror neuron theory, in the mirror neuron hypothesis, basically for instance, for one important reason, that there is sparse evidence in humans for mirror neurons. It's been hard to find mirror neurons, for instance, in Broca's area or in other areas. In fact, we might say that almost every associative hub in our cortex to some extent behaves as a mirror neuron system. So we might say we don't have a one mirror neuron system, we have like 200 mirror neuron systems, right? So the strong hypothesis that we would only have one mirror neuron system, which would be probably localized in Broca's area. Second, I told you already, double dissociations. The damage to a motor system does not lead to comprehension deficits, okay? So if you claim that your linguistic processing is done by motor areas, you predict that if you have a damage to motor areas, you should have some linguistic deficits. But this is exactly what you don't get with the double dissociation. So if you have aphasia, you have your motor programs intact. Otherwise, you would call it, like, for instance, motor apraxia, not aphasia, right? So welcome all these cases of double dissociation. For instance, ideational apraxia versus motor apraxia. With ideational apraxia, you recognize a gesture or a tool, but you don't know how to use it. With motor apraxia, you know how to use it. Sorry. With ideational apraxia, you recognize a tool, but you don't know how to use it. With motor apraxia, you recognize a tool, you know how to use it, but you do not manage to perform the correct mechanisms, okay? So for instance, with the ideational apraxia, you see a mocha to make a coffee, you know that is a mocha, you know that is to make coffee, but you're not able to, you don't even know how to describe the steps to make coffee. With motor apraxia, you know what it is for, you know, you can tell me exactly the steps how to make coffee, but you're not able to do it yourself. With with visual agnosia instead, you don't recognize the object, okay? You see a mocha, you do not recognize it, but then if I ask you to make a coffee, you're going to be able to make a coffee for me, okay? So you see the double dissociation. The knowledge about the object, but the inability to use it, the disrupted knowledge or recognition of the object, but the ability to use it, okay? Which suggests that these different skills are implemented in different systems.
How would you make the coffee if you can't recognize?
Where you actually recognize and use, but don't know how to name it or how to talk about that, okay? So all this is evidence for a more specific localization of different functions, and again, some kind of general principle like mirror neurons in just one circuit doing all the job.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
How would you make coffee if you with visual agnosia, if you don't recognize the device? So is something enabling you to recognize it if you are more or less using that program to do that, so that in that case you can recognize it, but otherwise you wouldn't?
So the idea, is that with agnosia, right, you have a deficit at the recognition of the object, which is just not verbal, but it's supposed to be multimodal, right? So for instance, I don't know, I can show you a mocha, and then I can show you some pictures, like a picture of a kitchen, a picture of, I don't know, a garage, right? And I ask you, where would you put the mocha? And then maybe you're going to put it in the garage. And then I ask you, what's the name of this? And then maybe you cannot know the name. And then I ask you, describe what you could use it for. And then you don't really know. And then I tell you, okay, look, I would like a coffee. Can you make a coffee? And then you tell me, yeah, sure. And then you take the mocha, you put the coffee, and you make a coffee.
So that program still works?
Sorry?
So that program for how to make a coffee still works in that
exactly.
case.
So you might have a preservation of the motor programs and the sequence on how to perform these programs in order to get the goal that you want to get to, right? So in order to make a coffee, but you don't have a more abstract representation of this, basically, which will be used for verbalization or for recognizing that, okay? And then you can have the opposite pattern. So you might have
I assume it also helps if the coffee device, mocha, whatever, is in the same place in a familiar environment, etc.
Yeah, then you can also have you can also have this sort of effect of familiarization, right? So then we are going to talk about that a little bit for aphasia. So with certain syndromes, you are actually facilitated, for instance, by contextual cues, but for other syndromes, you're not. So that tells you something about the locus of the disruption of the system, right? So, I mean, I'm not an expert on agnosia, apraxia, and whatever, but I might tell you that if, for instance, if the context facilitates the recognizing the object, maybe it means that the links between, for instance, the areas that process, like, for instance, the memory of your, whatever the episodes where you were using the tools, or the association between your schema of the context and the schema of the tool, that these representation are sort of disrupted. So if you provide a lot of information to try to activate them, then at some point you're going to get a better performance. But if you had a deficit in another network, you can boost the contextual information as much as you want, but it will not help you because the disruption is some elsewhere, okay? For instance, let's say in your premotor cortex, where you have the motor programs and the knowledge about the sequence on how to make these, on how to perform these acts, okay? If that is impaired, it doesn't matter if I'm going to give you a lot of information about the context and your memories of using Memoka and what more, right? You're not going to be able to do it because you cannot put together all the right motor programs of this, okay? And, you know, there are many hypotheses on how could you actually adopt an embodied view of language but still maintaining a sort of a holistic connectionist model. And we're not going to talk about that because we don't have time. But let me just tell you that, like, sort of, you know, embodied theories of language are still very famous in both neuroscience and psycholinguistics. I would say in a more weaker form than these strong claims that have been made in the field of mirror neurons and also in the field of, you know, some sort of behaviorism inspired theories, okay? But yeah, I mean, if you go to hardcore neuroscience, probably many people would still prefer this kind of thinking rather than a more formal neurolinguistic like approach, okay? Okay, if there is no other question, I would take a break. Okay? And then we can go to the very, very final part. Okay. Can you see this picture? Do you see slides? Yeah? Good. So what I try to do is like a few slides condensing a lot of information about lesional data and functional experiments, a lot of which we talked about, and also some connectivity pattern, okay? I mean, I haven't put the details because otherwise it will take a life. So very, very few references. But then again, you know, most of the references about this stuff is stuff we talked about. And if you're interested about this, I will send you my review that I'm writing where you have all this information in like about 10 pages, okay? So let's take one step back and look at our beautiful brain once again, okay? Here, I colored the cortical areas that are thought to be involved in language processing, including some basic areas which are also important for language, of course, but also as a reference, right? So you see the M1 and the S1, right? This is your primary motor cortex. This is your primary sensory cortex, okay? And you see this is your primary auditory cortex, right at the bottom of your sensory cortex. And you might wonder, why is it so small? And one of the reasons why A1 is small is that it actually extends ventrally, okay? So certain areas appear bigger just because we are looking at just one dimension of the cortex, right? And also the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is actually ventral medial. So if this is your brain, it's actually going to be like below here. I just put it here, but actually what you see here is more like the orbital frontal cortex. The insula is right inside, right? Ventrally in the opposite face of your hemisphere. Yeah. And then for instance, the superior temporal sulcus is a sulcus, so you cannot really see it, right? And all the other areas are many of them should be familiar to you. Here's Broca's, right? With your nice gradient from the proper Broca's area to the more anterior inferior frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, right? Central sulcus, dividing the brain into frontal and parietal lobe. This is inferior parietal sulcus. This is your supramarginal gyrus, which along with the posterior superior temporal gyrus makes your Wernicke's area, right? And then This is your anterior temporal gyrus. Sorry, your anterior superior temporal gyrus. This is your middle temporal gyrus, and this is your inferior temporal gyrus, right? Which slice your temporal cortex in 3 layers. And the most anterior part is the famous ATL, which we discussed about last time, about, tell you what. And then again, the famous angular gyrus, also called Geschwind's territory. And you see it's very contiguous, very close to the Wernicke's area. So that's why sometimes when you talk about Wernicke's aphasia due to Wernicke's territory's damage, is not really damage to Wernicke's area, but including other areas. And we discussed about that. Some areas that we haven't really talked about is like this BA6, which is supplementary motor cortex. So it's associative motor cortex. BA46, which is part of the middle frontal gyrus, involved in reasoning, abstract thinking, and also one thing that is called the default mode network, which is supposed to be associated with conscious thinking in a resting state. So when you're doing nothing and you are sitting in an fMRI scan, laying under an fMRI scan, and you think about whatever you might think, then there are certain areas that are kind of always working. One of these is the BA46, one of these is your angular gyrus, and one of these is the temporal cortex, okay? So you have sort of these 3 areas, you know, popping up when you do nothing, which is my favorite circuit. And then you also have this other prefrontal cortex area, very important. We talked about a little bit of ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which was active in for semantics task, but these are also very important for decision-making, error detection, conflict, dealing with conflicts, and emotion processing, okay? Because your emotional processing system behind your frontal gyrus, in your ancient part of the brain, like for instance, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and those areas, near the hippocampus and the renal cortices, medially and ventrally compared to these areas, right? They are all connected to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And you remember all the emotion words processing that we mentioned were kind of here frontally. Cool. So yeah, any question about these areas? Anything that is not clear? Sorry. Now we're going to dive through these different parts of the brain to see actually what happens when they are damaged a little bit more in detail, and kind of trying to isolate different parts of this, right? So for instance, if I ask you, what are the areas that are more important for syntax, given what we have seen? What would you say? The first person who answers is going to get a bonus for the grade. No, I'm kidding.
Broca's area, so BA44, BA45.
Yeah. One is Broca's area, right?
Yes.
Another one? Can you give me another area?
No, not primary auditory cortex.
Shoot.
No. Anterior STG.
Very good. Very
Yes.
good bet. Yes. Very good bet. Mm-hmm. Some people claim anterior, some people claim posterior, right? Now we'll see a little bit, but yes, very good. Right, so here's our syntax. BA44, specific for structure building. BA45, when you get a verb or some derivational morphology or some semantics. And then this area is projecting to anterior STG, which does a lot of phonological processing, but also if you have this area damage, you might have syntactic deficits, as well as posterior STG, which is connected to all the lexical areas. So probably provides some lexical information on some link between lexicon and syntax, okay? And also, I haven't mentioned that because I actually cannot see them, but there are these areas like the insular cortex, very important, right? And also the frontal operculum, which is right next to, between the Broca's area and the insular cortex. And sometimes these are just considered part of Broca's area. Okay, so this would be our nice syntax network. What is the evidence for this? In a lot of functional imaging studies, you see the co-activation of inferior frontal gyrus, STGs, and STS for syntactic processing, okay? In a lot of studies. Right, but then someone might say, yes, but you know, if you find an activation, it might just be because you are thinking about the words that you have to utter. So maybe this is just, you know, articulatory processing. This is just auditory processing, high-level auditory processing. Why do you tell me this is syntax? Well, because if you happen to have a damage to Broca's territory, you're very likely to get production articulation deficits, partly because there are some areas very important for articulation and production of language right next to Broca's area, for instance, supplementary motor cortex, insular cortex, and these areas. But you also get agrammatism. You also get probably specific agrammatism deficits. We have seen impairment of understanding, passive sentences, object relatives, subject relatives, and a lot of these examples, okay? And we also have seen also how different languages, in fact, produce different observable linguistic deficits with the same kind of damage because of their linguistic properties, okay? So yes, you get agrammatism, you get production deficits, but you also get comprehension deficits, okay? It is not true that Broca's aphasia only has production deficits. It is not true that Wernicke's aphasia only have comprehension deficits. This idea, very, very famous 50, 60 years ago, is wrong, is incorrect, okay? You have more severe deficit in production and comprehension, but you have production deficits with Wernicke's aphasia and comprehension deficit with Broca's aphasia as well, okay? For instance, you are not likely to understand sentences longer than 4 words if you have Broca's aphasia, okay? Especially sentences that involve some sort of complexity, and you might say yes because you need your syntax to work out this complexity. Yes, but you know, we are talking about the comprehension deficits, so that also tells you how syntax is important for comprehension, which shouldn't be surprising for us. Good. But then the rule of thumb is that when is it the case that you get worse and more persisting deficits, okay? In many cases, if you have a specific selective lesion of your Broca's area, after a few weeks, you are going to be much, much better. You probably, in some cases, if your lesion is only in one hemisphere and localized, you are going to recover all of your deficits. How is that possible? If that area housed the neurons that were performing the processes and were processing the information and were coding the representations that are necessary for understanding syntax, how is it possible that if you get rid of that particular area, then at some point your function is going to come back? Because we know that there is functional takeover. And this was Valerie's question. Unfortunately, Valerie is not here, but I'm going to write her an email because I did my homework finally. So as we don't know a lot in details about how these things happen, right? I would like to remind you that we don't even have figured out how the nervous system of a microscopic worm with the hundreds of neurons work, okay? But we have some kind of good ideas about what happens when we recover a function. And this is what happens. 2 things. First, the language areas in your right hemisphere, if you have language localized in your left hemisphere, the language areas on your right hemisphere are going to start specifically processing linguistic information. So you have a sort of a transfer from the dedicated area in the dedicated hemisphere to the contralateral hemisphere. Okay, so your right Broca's area is going to probably start doing something that your left Broca's area was doing. Okay, and people have found that this especially happens if the damage in your left areas is actually quite extended and severe. Okay, so no wonder that if you have bilateral damage, your symptoms are going to be more persistent because you are literally blocking this interhemispheric takeover. Okay, but there is another thing that happens. So what has been called map extension. So preserved regions in your left hemisphere, which are close to the regions that have been damaged, are going to start doing that job. And there are a couple of reasons for why this might happen. First of all, we know that contiguous regions are anatomically more similar compared to regions that are far away. And we know that there is a reason for this, is that the anatomy of a brain tissue is in a way determines the functionality of that tissue. Okay, so to give you a very simple example, Broca's area might be specialized for sequential processing, for instance, digitalizing information into discrete units like words, syntactic phrases, phonological units, and so on and so forth. Whereas your temporal cortex might do something like more frequency analysis. So to apply a sort of a Fourier transformation or frequency analysis of a given stimulus that you hear, right? And then you have to sort of map this information to what is stored in your semantic memory, and to find and to figure out that the sound that you hear belongs to a predator or a bird or something that you want to eat, right? So different areas have a different anatomy and different cyto and receptorial properties, which are connected deterministically to their function. But yet the function of a piece of cortex is not, there is not a one-to-one correspondence between the computational function of a cortex and the high-level function that we talk about when we consider behavior, like comprehension, production, right? So when we talk about function at the micro level, we are really talking about the kind of computation that this piece of cortex performs. So this should remind you about, for instance, the 3 levels of MAR, right? Implementation level, what exactly a piece of brain is doing. Computational level, what kind of processing algorithms and representations are going on, right? What kind of primitives are we talking about? And the highest level, algorithmic and computational level, which is at more a high level, what is a function doing, and what is what are the how is a function performed, and on what kind of representation it operates. So from more macro level to a more micro level. Okay, so these questions are very relevant when you try to explain these kind of patterns, like for instance functional takeover, right? And also in most of the major aphasic syndromes, the damage is extended to the insular and orbital regions, so the regions inside the Broca's area. Okay, so most of the things that we know from the past, like for instance damage of Broca's territory leads to Broca's aphasia, are not completely correct, because in those lesions what you had was actually more extended impairment of, for instance, pericilian regions, but also more ventral regions like insula, okay? So we have to be careful about this. Okay. Right. So another very interesting thing, and you know, not many people discuss about this because it's not easy to explain, is that in our cortex, especially in the linguistic areas, we have all these things called gradients of information processing. Again, this might not surprise you, just considering syntax and semantics, but we might put phonology as well into the picture, right? I just try to simplify it. You get this gradient going from BA44 to BA47 with BA45 in between. Where here you have more syntactic processing and here you have more semantic processing, which does not mean that you have a clear border between your syntax and your semantics, but it's more a sort of a gradient, right? We don't really know why, if it's because our instrument is not precise enough or because it's really with respect to the neural population that are operating in this area, there are some that are sort of, you know, doing some jobs in between. We don't know, but we should definitely notice that these kind of gradients are not an exception in our brain, but they're the rule, because you find them in every area, in every territory, which is particularly relevant for language. So for instance, you find it here, but you also find it in your superior temporal gyrus. So someone correctly said that some people claim that syntax is mostly localized in the anterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, along with phonology. But then if you move posteriorly, you actually get to certain areas which are more relevant for interpretation. So for semantics or probably lexical access. We don't know that from this slide, okay? Going to the angular gyrus. And then, you know, the relationship with phonology is a little bit tricky, so I'm not gonna go into that, okay? So we have these nice gradients. Right, so again, we have a gradient from semantics to syntax in your inferior frontal gyrus. We have a gradient from posterior temporal areas to anterior temporal areas. And we have a gradient, yeah, I wrote it twice, good. I wanted to write a gradient from, even from temporal areas to more parietal areas, the angular gyrus, right? Which does a lot of multisensory information and also contextual integration and also semantic processing, okay? So this kind of a big gradient. Okay, then let's add our temporal cortex, right? So let's add our middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus. Well, we get two more gradients. So one is from syntax to lexicon, right? So it would be like something like this. So the more you move caudally or you know, towards the inferior direction, the more you get into lexical processing from syntax semantics processing, okay? So if you move from STG to MTG, you actually enter in the lexicon territory. But then again, if you just focus on your temporal cortex, if you move from MTG to ITG, again, in functional imaging studies, you would find this area more active for sentence processing rather than single word processing. Whereas this area would be more active for single word processing rather than sentence processing, okay? So another gradient from word to sentence. Good. Yeah, so probably I should just wait for the next slide. But yeah, sorry about this. Okay, so then again, what happens? What happens when you have a damage to these areas? And what can the lesional data tell us about the property of the system? Well, again, if you look carefully at the lesional data, they tell you that what you often get is a damage to certain areas that are not supposed to do certain jobs, like Broca's area, and you get affecting functions that are processed in different areas. Like, typical example, if you get a damage to Broca's territory, you will obtain longer latencies in lexical decision tasks. Okay, so why is it the case? I just told you that the lexicon is processed in your temporal cortex, probably even in your posterior STG, but not really in your Broca's area, right? Broca's area is not very famous for lexical processing. Well, you know, if you think, for instance, about sentence building, right? If you think about processing a sentence like, the boy kicks the ball, in order to build, for instance, the DP, the boy, you have to access to certain lexical features of the noun boy. And we might think that these lexical features are stored in these areas, but then your Broca's territory is going to be in constant communication with your more posterior temporal territories in order to access this information, which are relevant for the kind of processing that the Broca's area has to do, structure building. Is anyone asking a question or just noise? Okay. So, you know, I'm providing you already a reason why you get these sort of effects from the damage to one area to a function that is supposed to be processed in a different area, okay? And this, in a way, is reminiscent of what has been called disconnection syndromes in the literature, okay? Famous disconnection syndromes, a damage to the white matter of the fibers that connect your Wernicke's to your Broca's, and you get a repetition deficit. Why do you get a repetition deficits? Because the fibers, the neural fibers that are bringing the lexical information back and forth and the phonological information are disrupted. So even if your informational centers, informational processors work, there is no transmission of information between these areas, okay? So, yeah. Question. These gradients can sort of confirm the existence of interfaces that we talk in linguistics. Yes, that's a very cool thing. Yes, that is exactly what I would like to say. Yes, right? So the idea, so in linguistics, a lot of people talk about interfaces, right? So for instance, when syntax is communicating with semantics, there is a kind of in-between layer of operational stuff that is sort of integrating the information from both domains, right? This is precisely what, you know, certain parts of these regions could do, or for instance, other areas could do. For instance, I'm saying for instance too many times, if you claim that your syntax is here and your lexicon is here and your phonology is here, what these areas might do is to make the lexical information visible to the syntactic processor, okay? Which is exactly what in linguistics interface theories and you know, models, theoretical models at the interface are supposed to do, okay? You know, again, this is completely speculative and you have to work that out a lot, but I think the idea is great. Yes, so thanks for that. And right. So yeah, and then if you have damage to Wernicke's territory, you have very simple, very clear deficit, disruption to the access of lexicon. So you do not access the meaning of words because you cannot connect the phonological form of the word to the lexical item, to the concept that is associated with that lexical item. But you also have syntactic deficits. You also have phonological deficits, like phonological paraphasias, okay? You switch some syllables with other syllables, you switch some words with other words. And so you show a wide range of deficits which are not specific to lexical processing. Okay, so in a lot of studies, they investigated Broca's aphasic patients and Wernicke's aphasic patients, and they say, look, both groups of aphasic patients display syntactic deficits. How is it possible if you just told me that agrammatism is associated with Broca's lesions? And then there are two reasons for this again. One reason is that these lesions are not pure. So, you know, you are not precise when you say that these guys only have lesions to the Broca's area. But the other explanation is that even if you are a lesion to this area, you are going to cause a disruption to the information in other areas to which this information is transmitted, especially if you have axonal damage, especially if the lesion enters the fibers. Okay, so yeah, cool. So now let's move to semantics a little bit. And this should be stuff that is a little bit fresher in mind, right? So in neuroscience, common law knowledge, at least until a few decades ago, was that the areas processing semantic information is Wernicke's area, or the surrounding areas to Wernicke's area. So temporal regions, posterior temporal regions, okay? But then, in the last years, the importance of this region, the angular gyrus, have been considered more and more, okay? For instance, in this nice review by Binder 2009, it actually seems that the angular gyrus is the region near the temporal areas, near Wernicke's areas, which is more selective for semantic information. What kind of semantic information? Comprehension of temporal and spatial meaning. For instance, preposition, temporal adverbs, spatial adverbs. You remember a few days ago I mentioned about this guy who had a specific lesion to the angular gyrus. He had immediate aphasia, but then after a few weeks, the aphasia was much better. It still had a permanent impairment of understanding, temporal and spatial adverbs, okay? And also semantically syntactic complex sentences. So this tells you that, sorry, here I was talking about functional imaging studies, yeah. So in functional imaging studies, the angular gyrus pops up, lights up in a lot of semantic contrast, okay? Especially for function words and for temporal spatial processing. And also when the complexity of the sentence is increased. So when you have specific complex sentences involving some sort of complex information. So operation. Now, you know, the term complexity is very vague, right? In our natural speech, we use a lot of these sort of complex sentences, but when you run an experiment, anything could sort of appear to be complex if it goes beyond the 3 to 4 word sentence, right? So this is, yeah. For the X's, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised, yeah. I can do some research if you want. So, yes. So there is this, you know, again, this idea that frontal areas and posterior areas are both required for these complex functions like semantics, okay? At least from imaging studies. But then again, we want to have some supporting evidence from lesional studies. Right. And then we can add lexicon to the picture. So if you get a damage of these areas here, right? Angular gyrus, posterior STG, middle temporal gyrus, you usually get comprehension deficits. So either you get Wernicke's aphasia, or you get the so-called transcortical aphasia, which is very, very similar to Wernicke's aphasia, but you have intact repetition, okay? So people have been asking themselves, why do you get comprehension deficits? Is it because you get it that you're not able to go from the phonological information or the phonological representation of a word to the meaning of the word? Well, sometimes, yes, of course. If you have a damage to these areas, this is all phonological processing, right? Also. But not only that. And how do we know that? Because the comprehension deficits in these syndromes are often multimodal. So they would extend at different modalities, like auditory modality, visual modality, written modality. And if you have a generalized deficit, then you might infer that there is a sort of a more generalized processing, okay? So yes. But then what happens when you get a damage to these areas, right? What happens when you get a damage to the ATL, which is thought to be a hub for conceptual processing, at least for certain concepts. And it's supposed to receive projection from all the temporal cortex, but also from the frontal cortices, and also from the visual cortices, and also from the auditory cortices, from everywhere, basically. A hub connecting together the associations about your knowledge of things and people, okay? So if you get a damage to this area, which is very, very frequent in semantic dementia, you have a lot of overlapping deficits with Wernicke's aphasia, but milder comprehension deficits. Here there's a deficit word missing, okay? So your comprehension of complex sentences is much, generally better, significantly better. You have more anomic symptoms, so difficulty at retrieving the words, the representation of the words to produce them, to name them, right? And an interesting thing, which tells you about how this system works, is that repetition helps if you have a damage in Wernicke's territory, which suggests that if you provide more information to trigger lexical access, then you might get improvement of performance. Instead, if you have a semantic aphasia due to damage at the anterior temporal lobes, repetition does not help. You get the best performance at the first presentation of the item, which suggests that the problem is not at the lexical level, but more at the conceptual level. Or you get lexical access, but you're not able to connect the lexical access to conceptual retrieval. Okay? Right. Also, other gradients, conceptual gradients. If you get a damage, so some people claim, yeah, okay, the ATL is your conceptual hub. Here's where your semantic memory, where your concepts are, okay? But then, guess what? If you have a damage to your angular gyrus, you're going to have some conceptual deficits measured in difficulty at naming things, but also at recognizing things, okay? The difference between naming and recognition is that recognition, for instance, can be tested without verbal material, okay? Whereas naming, you really have to pronounce the word that corresponds to a certain concept. And you might have both deficits, or one or the other, so you can get double dissociation, of course. But usually, these are associated with damage to angular gyrus and insula if they affect tools, natural or man-made objects. But if these deficits affect food, vegetable, or specific people, they are usually associated with damage to the anterior temporal lobes. So ATL and anterior MTG, STG, and ITG, plus the insula again. So the damage to the insula is the left insula especially, but also the right insula sometimes is associated with both these kind of deficits, which tell us something about the role of the insula in sort of modulating the whole network. Okay. Right. So what about putting things together, putting semantics, concept, and lexicon together, right? Is it meaningful to try to connect all these pieces together? Yes, probably it is, for two reasons. In functional imaging studies, you often find the co-activation of all the areas of these networks, or at least some of them. So in one study, you might find BA45 and 47 and the angular gyrus. In another study, you might find more MTG or ITG. In other studies, if you remember with MEG, with the magnetic encephalography, in a lot of studies, they found ATL activated, right? Along with posterior temporal regions. Whereas in another study, they found inferior frontal cortex co-activated with ATL. And in almost every study, they found ventromedial prefrontal cortex co-activated with ATL a little bit later, right? So again, a lot of evidence that supports that in a way, when you talk about semantic function in general, you require these three domains of information working in synchrony, which is completely plausible, right? Because in order to understand a sentence, you need to get the lexical access in order to get the meaning of these words. And then when you have to combine words together, you can do it, for instance, at the conceptual level or at the formal semantic compositional level, if one of these words, for instance, is a functor or if it's a quantifier, right? So yeah, makes sense. And if you put a lot of information together in the pot, then you're going to find that actually you might have aphasia, like some kind of aphasia with comprehension deficits. If you get a selective damage of each one of these areas, especially in the acute phase, right? So if you get a damage to your Broca's area or your insula or your angular gyrus or your temporal cortices, then you're going to get some sort of aphasia with comprehension impairment. And then after a few weeks, you might get complete recovery or a partial recovery. But the take-home message is that this is evidence that comprehension is recruiting the whole network, okay? And then if you have a damage at one of these points of the network, that will impair the function globally, at least in the initial stage. And then depending on where the damage is and depending on how extended it is, you might have different profiles of functional recovery, okay? The very important thing is that to appreciate the contribution of different areas does not lead to the conclusion that every single area does the same job or every single area works with the same principle. For instance, associative learning, okay? Statistical pattern recognition. It might be that all these areas in a way are sensitive to this sort of statistical learning, but the way they work is different. The way they perform this function is different, okay? So this is the challenge of the neuroscience and the neurolinguistics of the future, to integrate a connectionist-like model with a sort of a functional localization model. So to specify the specific processing feature, the specific algorithmic and computational features of each one of these single regions, but also to appreciate their contribution to a macro function that recruits a lot of different areas. Okay? And to conclude, we haven't talked about that, but there is, the big issue about whether linguistic semantics and non-linguistic semantics, like reasoning, math, time and space processing, share the same network. And different people provided different answers, okay? Stanislas Dehaene, for instance, says that the network for numeric cognition does not overlap with the network for language understanding. And I think this is not true. And it's not because because it's my personal opinion, but because if you read a lot of papers, you're going to find a lot of co-activation of these parts of the network. And so if you, for instance, in functional imaging studies, exploring math and numeric cognition, you have inferior frontal gyrus activation, inferior parietal sulcus activation, this area here, and the angular gyrus activation, okay? 2 of these 3 areas are also involved in semantic processing. So there is an overlap. And then, you might have the activation of this area here, the middle frontal gyrus, BA46, for deduction and for mathematical processing. And you might say that this area does not show up in linguistic processing and does not lead to specific linguistic deficits. So maybe this is part of a different network and it's not specifically involved in the language network, okay? But some areas are. Right. And also, remember, if you have a lesion to the angular gyrus, you might have aphasia, you might have impairment of comprehension of certain words, and also acalculia, so impairment of mathematical computation, okay? Any question? Okay, so you might be tired and I might have overflowed you with information. So I just want to show you a couple of slides on connectivity, okay? And then we are done. So, one of the questions would be, okay, I've shown you all these nice pictures of these networks, all these arrows, but how actually these areas communicate with each other? What stands for these white arrows, right? And people have argued about this for a long time. And again, recent research has kind of overturned what we thought, basically, which is interesting. So back in the days, we thought that the major communication path between Broca's and Wernicke's territory was this nice red thing called arcuate fasciculus or fasciculus arcuatus, okay? And it's arcuate because it makes this kind of bow thing. But now, many people found that actually this is more connected between the BA46 and the BA6 that I showed you and other temporal areas, whereas what really connects Broca's and Wernicke's territory is this blue thing called extreme capsule, which guess what? Almost originates and crosses the whole insular cortex. So the insular cortex might have a very important modulating function of the whole language circuit because it is basically surrounded by, or surrounds, in fact, the beginning of these very important tracts of fibers, okay? Now, yeah. So there is this other interesting study that correlated the brain morphology with the task the performance of different linguistic tasks. So phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics, okay? And what they found is that in comprehension tasks, the damage to the areas that are sort of highlighted in these pictures is associated with the reduced performance or impoverished performance at these tasks. And you see that here, for instance, in phonology, you have your supramarginal gyrus and your kind of Wernicke's areas, right? In morphology, you move a little bit more towards your posterior areas. So probably you have some more STG, STS, and some of the, again, supramarginal gyrus. But when you move to syntax, then you see the damage to your Broca's territory, your insular cortex, and your frontal operculum maybe. And on the one side, and on the other side, your posterior temporal areas like STG, angular gyrus, and again, probably supramarginal gyrus. And when you move to semantics, the correlation sort of extends to your whole temporal gyrus and includes the most anterior part, okay? Now you might wonder, yeah, but why I don't find my beautiful anterior inferior frontal gyrus here? Well, for two reasons. First of all, it depends what they meant by semantics here. Because in many tasks, people mean semantics when you have content words, and they call syntax when you have function words. But we as linguists know that there is a lot of semantics in function words. So what you actually might expect is that much of the stuff they call syntax involves a lot of semantics, and this would be your formal semantics processing. Or just go to production. And if you move to production, in phonology, you find kind of the same areas. In morphology, a very nice overlap in place. In syntax, same activation. In semantics, bang. Here's your anterior inferior frontal gyrus in its beauty, okay? And in this study, they specifically examined how these areas, the lesion to these areas that correlates with the performance in linguistic tasks is also associated with these two fiber tracts that I told you about. So the arcuate fasciculus and the extreme capsule. And you see your arcuate fasciculus really seems to cross the areas that are important for phonology and morphology, whereas your syntax and your semantics, it seems to be better connected by the extreme capsule. So there is this kind of shifting paradigm by saying that for grammar processing, grammatical processing, and syntactic semantic processing, it's not really the arcuate fasciculus anymore that is the most important part, but it's rather the so-called ventral stream or ventral system or this extreme capsule, okay? So this is just to show you that that there is a lot of evidence that the arrows that we designed before are actually implemented in real wide fiber tracts. Okay, just some nice, more beautiful picture of your fiber tracts. This is your extreme capsule. This is other stuff. Yeah, and what I want to show you, this one, I think it's very nice because it shows you that your extreme capsule, these green fibers really, really go from your frontal operculum, which is kind of the most extreme part of your orbitofrontal cortex, right? So Broca's area, and then it travels all the way to your posterior temporal cortex, and probably you need these other little fiber tracts, which is the mediolateral fasciculus, to retransmit the information to your angular gyrus, right? Yes, but your angular gyrus also receives information from this blue spider, which is SLF, superior lateral fasciculus, okay? So back in the days, we thought that it was all the arcuate fasciculus, but actually the arcuate fasciculus is rather connecting this to your premotor and middle frontal gyrus, and not really your Broca's area. So interesting information. Here again, this is another study which which shows that these fibers here, which is like a part of the arcular fasciculus and a part of these extreme capsules, kind of do this R here, but then to retransmit the information from your temporal cortex to your inferior frontal gyrus, you need these other two tractor fibers, which start and end into different points, okay? And especially, another beautiful thing is to appreciate that your anterior temporal lobe, your conceptual hub, does not directly project to your BA44, but it only projects to your BA47 and 45 through the insula. So probably the information, in order to get to BA44, either has to go all this way or must be reprocessed throughout your inferior frontal gyrus. So this looks like a sort of a loop, see, with a hole here. This hole is your Broca's region, is your inferior frontal gyrus, okay? And here you actually see with this kind of schema that if you take your BA47, right, where we said there is a lot of semantics, this is actually connected to the superior temporal gyrus directly, but also to this part of, I guess, the anterior temporal lobes. Yeah. So your anterior temporal lobes connect to the 47, whereas your Broca's area, 45 and 44, they connect directly to the MTG, right? But for instance, they do not connect directly to your inferior temporal gyrus. Except, no, they do, sorry. They would not connect, for instance, directly to your supramarginal gyrus. So in order to transmit the information to your supramarginal gyrus according to this model, you need to go through your MTG, okay? So this tells us that it's not true that everything is connected to everything. There are specific patterns in the interconnection of different areas. And it's important to also to take into the consideration this kind of connection patterns in order to figure out who is transmitting the information to who, okay? All right, I guess I ran out of time and slides. So I guess if there is any question, I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, yes, we're done. I hope this was helpful and understandable. And yeah, if you have any, any further questions or any further comments about this, feel free to write me emails or messages, or, if you have complaints or anything, please, you're welcome to express yourself. Any question? Any final thought? If not, thanks for the attention. And yeah, I hope to see you soon in real life somehow in a more friendly future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Don't worry too much about the exam. I will send you the relevant information, but don't be too much stressed about that. Okay?
Will you upload this presentation?
Yes. I will upload the previous presentation, this presentation, and this video as well.